Shabazz, break it down with the proper perspective. So much controversy and a lot of deception. You don't know who's coming through with the light and reflection, and whose mouth is mumbling, trick knowledge deceptive. Shabazz, break it down with the proper perspective. So much controversy and a lot of deception. You don't know who's coming through with the light and reflection, and whose mouth is mumbling, trick knowledge deceptive. Shabazz, break it down with the proper perspective. Break.
Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. We're gonna get this thing started. Mic check 1 2. We are gonna get it started, ladies and gentlemen. Once I make sure you can hear me, ladies and gentlemen. Mic check 1 2. First I was live, then I was not. So we're trying to make sure everything is working. So make sure you can hear me, ladies and gentlemen. Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. It looks like everything is copacetic. If you can hear me, and if you are in the chat room, say something, let me know. If not, I'm gonna keep doing these little checks. Mic check 1 2. This is Shabazz with the proper perspective. Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. This is Shabazz with the proper perspective. Mic check 1 2. Good morning, everybody. How y'all doing? I really shouldn't be saying good morning. I belong to that Grand Rising camp, for real, for real. What's going on, everybody? How y'all doing? Grand Rising, everybody. This is your brother Shabazz, a.k.a. Professor W, a.k.a. Professor Shabazz, a.k.a. And I probably shouldn't say this one because I really don't have a religion, but I'm going, just for a hot second, I'm going to say a.k.a. Minister Shabazz. And why am I calling myself Minister Shabazz? Well, I will have you know, I did go online during COVID, and I did follow the appropriate protocols to get myself, at least on paper, ordained as a minister, if for no other reason, so that I could make sure I covered myself when I told my boss, I'm not taking the jab. Because there was a time when they was mandating the jab, and I was of the mind that I don't want that in my system. And they had said, you know, you have to have some religious documentation in order to avoid the mandate. So I hustled myself on over to whatever website it was, I can't remember. And I did fill out the appropriate paperwork so that I could call myself Minister Shabazz, and I could tell my boss, according to my religious perspectives, my religious freedoms, my spiritual rights do not allow me to inject myself with whatever it is that you have placed in those vials. Now, that was not something that I was doing in such a way as to promote defiance. But, hey, that was me. That still is me. I didn't take the jab. My system is clean of those materials. So, every now and then I am reminded of that. And I was reminded that sometimes you can get some coverage over here on these YouTube streets if you remind the algorithm that you have at least a ministerial name. So Minister Shabazz might be part of my proclamation from now on. But I say all of that just as yes, I digress. But like I said, this is your brother Shabazz with the proper perspective. Peace to all the positive people in the universe. What's good to my people in Richmond, Virginia, if you're still around, and Hotep to the Pan-African Black world. And if I ain't covered everybody just yet, maybe this last little tagline will welcome you into the fold. All the real ones, the A1s from day one, all the real ones who look through the smoke and mirrors, who see through the smoke and mirrors. You are all welcome on the Proper Perspective YouTube train. Now, today's journey is about history, so we are going back in time. Not just what happened. We're not going to talk about just what happened. This is not a just effects rendition of the page in history we will be reviewing. But we're going to look at the echoes of that historical era. We're going to look at how those echoes resound across time. And we'll be exploring how power rises from the shadows, shaped by stories, symbols, and sacrifices. So if that interests you, if that intrigues you, if you're curious, hit the like button. Hit the notification bell. Drop a comment, if you will. And I will respond to the comments. If you're curious, hit the like button. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I get this show started, take care of a couple of things. One of the things I need to take care of is, see, where did it go? Where did it go? So, I guess it's no longer here. So, okay, well, I had a comment that I wanted you guys to respond to. The comment is gone, so I'll just continue. So like I said, what we are talking about today, we're talking about some history. Our story centers on a young man from an East European country whose fate, as it would happen, whose fate became a spark for a radical movement's rise. This is the story of Horst Wessel. Now, if I don't get the exact proper pronunciation, please excuse me. The language from which this story comes is not my original language, it's not my language of birth, and so I will struggle with it. But Horst Wessel, or rather, this is the tale of his death. And it is also the tale of the birth of a system, the birth of tyranny, some might say. So now, you might be, if you are curious, you might be asking yourself, what did he say? What was that word? I'm going to drop that in the comment. Let's see. Let me drop that in the comment section, if I can, if I dare. And that way you can see it you can see it at least there, if not in addition to hearing me say it. I might try to get it onto the screen. Let's see. Where do we have? What do we have here? Okay. Horst Wessel is the name of our individual in history today. And hold on, ladies and gentlemen. Hold on, ladies and gentlemen. Hold on, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get it together, I promise. Let's see. Where did it go? Okay. So, here we go. So, if you want to know what it was, Horst Wessel. That was the name. Okay. So, we're having all kinds of technical difficulties this morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I was saying, we're going to be discussing Horst Wessel. Now, he was an ordinary young man, swept up in what they call violent clashes between competing forces in his homeland. Now, if any of this starts to sound familiar to you, let me know. Because I do want to know.
Here's a little story I got to tell about.
That's what we're doing. We're telling a story today. So Horst Wessel was an ordinary young man, swept up in violent clashes between competing forces in his homeland. Now, he belonged to a paramilitary group, and it was called, now here come one of these words from that language, it was called the Sturmabteilung. The Sturmabteilung. Now again, if I said it wrong, excuse me. But interestingly enough, the abbreviation for this group that he belonged to, this may very well be intriguing for you. It was often abbreviated as SA. Now, if that don't beat all as a modern day application. But this SA back then, while we might be able to play with some philosophical angles on it, this SA really belonged to what became known as the brown shirts of this radical movement. Now, they fought fiercely against what they called Die Rotsflut. That's translated into the Red Scourge. These battles were not just physical fights. They were physical. They were extremely physical. But they were not only physical fights. They were struggles for the hearts and minds of a nation that was, to some extent, being torn apart. Now, this might sound familiar to you. And if so, say something in the comments. Wessel was a passionate and driven young man. Now, he was thrown into the chaos of street wars under flickering lamplights, where every confrontation was a fight for survival. This was 1930s, ladies and gentlemen. Now, there happened a time in one of these skirmishes that he got involved in, a certain projectile, a certain whistling dart, soared at great speed, suddenly plucking the young chap from the bosom of these mortal coils. That's just what happened. Yes, his untimely demise was no mere passing, however. It began a groundswell of outpour, and it became an immortalized passing. The movement, the radical movement that existed, seized upon this opportunity. And like I said, they made it an immortalized passing. And it began to be used in such a way as to be carefully woven into the fabric of that rising radical movement. Now, if you're tuning in and if you're catching these drifts, I'm talking about history. I'm talking about the historical epic of a time period in another country. But parallels do exist. The leaders seized on his departure. They crafted a legend. An anthem was born from his own words that became the heartbeat of their cause. That anthem echoed through the streets. It was played at rallies. And it began to sink into the hearts and the minds of the people. It was calling followers to loyalty and sacrifice. And it ignited a storm of strife that would define a nation's coming of age. This was the story of Horst Wessel. Now, again, you may sense some common threads into that. And I won't be angry at you if you do. I won't be surprised if you do. It's part of the reason I'm telling this story. But let us move on into section 2 of this tantalizing tale. Now we're going to get into a little bit of the analysis of the story. Why does in these kinds of movements? Why did this consecrated fall hold the force and the vigor that it did in that movement? Because there's something about a martyr. Martyrs become more than, they become bigger than, larger than life. Martyrs they're bigger than the individual. They are vessels for ideas. They are symbols. Symbols of what you might have. Symbols of sacrifice. Symbols of unity. First, martyrs unify followers emotionally. They turn sorrow into sharp purpose. And they bind individuals. Some might say blindly. They bind individuals into one cause. Secondly, they justify harsh actions against enemies who are blamed for the immortalized passing, making violence feel righteous. This mechanism is what we might call the stochastic engine. The stochastic engine. The use of mass communication to radicalize followers and incite random acts of ill-willed merriment and highly targeted and harmful mischief, if you will. Now, you might be wondering to yourself as I'm going over this, why is he talking like this? Just if you're picking up what I'm putting down, y'all see how I'm dancing around the algorithm? If you weren't picking up what I'm putting down, do you now see why I'm down? Do you now see how I'm dancing around the algorithm? Because these harmful acts of mischief are statistically predictable, but legally untraceable to the source. So the source cannot be held accountable. The martyr becomes the perfect justification for the acts of random hostility that was already being stirred up, and it is now beginning to take on a more full-throttled approach. That's two of the reasons martyrdom becomes a rallying cry. And thirdly, such martyrdom silences critics, turns questioning into betrayal. Betrayal of a sacred mission, betrayal of a sacred identity. They target the gegenpress. What is gegenpress? They target the counter voices. They target the opposition and the opposition narrative. Now, you don't defeat the gegenpress by debating it. And this is why they used it. You don't defeat the gegenpress by debating it. You silence it. You discredit it. You make an example of anyone who dares to speak against the new mythology. By raising up a figure like Horst Wessel, the radical movement created not just a hero, but a legend. That legend was a new weapon. Y'all done heard about weapons of mass destruction.
Y'all done heard about weapons of mass distraction. This weaponized legendariness used to rally and to intimidate, used to crush opposition under the tightening veil of the coming throne of darkness. Such stories are as old as tyranny itself, and they recur every time power seeks to tighten its grip. So this is why we're telling this story today, ladies and gentlemen. So let us move on into section 3 of this story. Because you might, if you're picking up what I'm putting down, then you might catch the vibe. You might begin to notice a pattern. How tyranny takes root. Because tyranny never bursts forth fully armed overnight. You hear people saying, bring it on. You hear people saying, we ready. Ain't none of them ready. Tyranny never bursts forth fully armed overnight. Although there are quite a few factions under the tyranny umbrella that might be getting prepared. But tyranny creeps quietly like a fog rolling across fields at dawn. So let me tell you how this pattern usually unfolds. The enemies are painted as threats. Threats to the nations, threats to the nation's soul. They may get called colorful adjectives like the Red Scourge. They may get called traitors. They may get called outsiders. Some of those enemies get singled out. Comedians get pulled to the carpet. Artists get canceled. Critical thinkers, people who are known for speaking their mind, especially if it's with a little bit of a militant idea behind them, they speak freely, they get pushed out. They get fired from highly esteemed positions. They get silenced, they get blocked. Laws begin to get rewritten, bending and twisting, steering institutions towards serving one dominant creed or one charismatic leader. Independent voices in media begin to get squeezed out. They're fired. They're suspended indefinitely. So that people who might be sitting in the middle might say, well, you know, a suspension isn't termination. They get canceled. They get deplatformed. They get forced to build their own networks. And there can be some positives to that. But they are forced to build their own networks just to be heard outside the new coordinated narrative. Sound familiar? You get new anthems. You get new flags sometimes. You get this all bow down and recognize the honor and the immortalized passing, the passing of the new immortalized legendary figure. They get raised high, and the system demands loyalty, and the system smothers doubt. Now, the first wave of this new radical movement is usually called a soft wave, because it gets the heavy lifting done without the clatter of whistling darts, without the clatter, without the shock and awe. It fires up fear, it curbs free speech, and it begins to reshape and change the culture. Now, this radical movement had a word for this process of forcing all the institutions into alignment with their new ideology. Now, you're gonna like this word if you like terminology, if you like vocabulary, if like me you are a nerd, a blurred. black nerd, and just in case somebody not sure what that meant, it's called Gleichschaltung. 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 It means coordination. More accurately, it means bringing into line. Bringing into line. Now later, harder crackdowns begin. But the foundation is set well before the harder crackdowns. The foundation is set with the symbols and the shadow. And this brings me to the title of today's show. Mythology. Mythology for the masses. The story of the 13th disciple. We're getting there. So you may be thinking by now, at least, if not already, you may have already come to it. Hey, this is no ancient tale. This tactic is playing out right before our very eyes. And you would be right. Just last week, politicians who once decried divisive rhetoric have begun leaning into it. Matter of fact, one particular politician stood in the hallowed halls of the chambers of the voted representatives, of the voted in elected. Now, as to whether or not the individual was compelled by fear or political lust, or a lack of a spine, I would imagine that all three of these probably can be attributed to several different individuals who have been elected to the houses, especially those who took a vote. Especially those who took a vote. They voted in affirmation, in confirmation of a day celebrating an individual whose legacy they had once condemned, all under the guise of some sense of a so-called unity. That you would be right if you preferred the term erasure. You would be right to call it erasure, but they're calling it unity. And just listen to the language that they're using. Now, and one of these particular U.S. senators from the great state of Texas, now I give a shout out to Jasmine Crockett, but this is not a quote from her. Another U.S. senator from Texas stood on the floor of Congress, those hallowed halls. He didn't just honor the fallen legend. He called the fallen legend the 13th disciple. Think about that. He actually said, if this man had been alive during the time of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, I have no doubt that he too would have been amongst the chosen. He would have been the 13th disciple. Now, this is not myth making right before our very eyes. Oh, the mythology. They're not just making a martyr, they're writing a new gospel. They are building a religion around this individual. And they're demanding our participation. And the vote that they had on the floor were even quite a few Democrats voted in favor of this. Shame on them. Shame on them. But quite a few Democrats did vote. I will have you know, though, just understand, many of the Democrats who are a part of the minority caucuses, they stood strong. They stood 10 toes down. So just give a shout out to them, because a lot of times in these YouTube circles, we like to criticize the Congressional Black Caucus. A lot of them did the right thing.
But we are now living in an era of new legend making, new myth making. And it brings me to what I would have called, when I was back in the classroom, a teachable moment. Section 4 of this story to tell. What then can we learn from the story of Horst Wessel and these timeless tricks of power? Be of the mind. History is a mirror. History is a mirror, not just a storybook. Be of the mind. History is a mirror, not just a storybook. So when we hear anthems that sing of sacrifice and heroism, the ones we are beginning to see come online today about this week's flavor of the month, this month's legendary fallen figure, it's no different than the other anthems that we've had to listen to. It's no different than the Star-Spangled Banner, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if you don't know why I say that, then perhaps you need to do your own little digging. Look into who wrote it. Look into all of the verses of the Star-Spangled Banner and come back and tell me that the Kirkathon is a new phenomenon. Because when dissenting voices vanish and enemies multiply, that's a historical repetition cycle. When politics turns sacred, when politics turns hardened divisions, us versus them, maybe it's time to ask, is this really that new? Or is this history repeating itself? Now, if it's not really that new, then you got to ask yourself another question. What part will you play? The earliest signs often whisper, not shout, so be of mind. The earliest signs are usually just quiet enough to be ignored until it's too late. Now, Horst Wessel's tale reminds us, tyrants don't just conquer with whistling darts. They conquer mind first. They craft legends. They divide people and they weaponize loyalty. So whenever your adversaries are conscripted into honoring the myth, and I do mean conscripted, even though I do criticize those Democrats that voted in honor of the myth, I recognize that there was some conscription going on. So when your adversaries are conscripted into honoring the myth, you know the legend has overtaken the truth. Or you know that's the agenda, for the legend to overtake the truth. Watch for who gets celebrated. Watch for whose stories are erased or whose stories try to get erased. But we not gonna let them erase them. So let us take a moment to reflect with this historical lens upon today's shocking news, so we are clear on who is with us, who is against us. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus, as I said, along with other minority caucuses, they were among the most prominent voices of dissent. And those are the ones that we need to keep an eye on, keep our minds on, keep supporting. Notable CBC members like Representative Jasmine Crockett explicitly spoke out against the resolution and publicly criticized colleagues who did not oppose it as she should have. Now, yes, this highlights a deep divide within the Democratic ranks over the Kirkathon. Reports emphasize that CBC and Congressional Hispanic Caucus members were heavily represented amongst those who voted no. So let that be a lesson to you. Let that sink in. Let us remember who's not falling for the okie doke. Now, if you're still listening, drop a comment, hit the like button, share this stream with someone, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. I thank you for joining this lesson in History's Echoes. Now, if this stirred your thoughts, like I said, like, share, and subscribe is the name of the game. Remember, seeing the patterns is the first step to changing the story before it's written. And I've said this before, stay aware. And I've said this before, stay safe. This has been Shabazz, your brother Shabazz, your professor Shabazz, your minister Shabazz. This is Shabazz with the proper perspective. And I will see you next time. Peace.
Shabazz break it down with the proper perspective.
The proper perspective.
So much controversy and a lot of deception. You don't know who's coming through with the light and reflection, and whose mouth is mumbling, trick knowledge deceptive. Shabazz break it down with the proper perspective. So much controversy and a lot of deception. You don't know who's coming through with the light and reflection, and whose mouth is mumbling, trick knowledge deceptive. Shabazz break it down with the proper perspective. Shabazz break it down with the proper perspective. Break it down with the proper perspective.